If you have been that extraordinary academic 17, 18-year-old who's managed to garner an offer from Harvard or Princeton or Yale or wherever it happens to be, you now don't know whether you're going to get a place there because you might not get a visa. If you've said anything untoward, you can't go and study in that country.
And the president is more interested in giving that taxpayer money to trade schools, in programs, in state schools, where they are promoting American values, but most importantly, educating the next generation based on skills that we need in our economy and our society. Apprenticeships, electricians, plumbers. We need more of those in our country and less LGBTQ graduate majors from Harvard University. And that's what this administration's position is.
To be fair, I don't think you do qualify from Harvard University with an LGBTQ degree. But that is Caroline Leavitt, the president's press secretary, saying, oh, screw Harvard at a time of quantum computing, AI, the battle for the greatest scientific minds. What we need are more painters and decorators. Why is the Trump administration so determined to tear down America's greatest academic institution? Welcome to the Newsagents USA.
The Newsagents USA.
It's John, and it is a riddle. Why is President Trump so determined to go after Harvard University with such venom and such aggression that you are more or less tearing down the single greatest academic institution in America that has been the recipient of umpteen Nobel Prizes, but has also provided the scientists, the brains that have started some of the most innovative companies in the United States, which attracts the brightest and the best from around the world, that leads to things like Silicon Valley happening, which leads the world in terms of the technology and IT and all the rest of it. Donald Trump is withdrawing federal funding from Harvard University because it will not accept the imposition of rules and regulations that effectively would mean that Harvard University would be under the control of the White House or a board sympathetic to the White House, so that more or less MAGA would be deciding who could serve as an academic professor or teacher in the faculty of this or that. Harvard is saying that's a line we cannot cross and are holding firm. And so Donald Trump keeps on turning up the heat, because the one thing that Donald Trump hates more than anything else is people who say no. And so overnight we hear that US embassies around the world are being told to stop all visa applications of foreign students who want to come and study in the United States. So if you have been that extraordinary academic 17, 18-year-old who's managed to garner an offer from Harvard or Princeton or Yale or wherever it happens to be, you now don't know whether you're going to get a place there because you might not get a visa. What will your visa depend on? Well, what your social media posts have been. Now, frankly, I don't know many 17 or 18-year-olds who haven't posted something that they probably now would think, that may not have been as smart as I would have liked it to have been, but they posted it nonetheless. Are we really going to an age of Puritanism now in America, where if you've said anything untoward, you can't go and study in that country? That is going to starve the United States of a lot of talent and seems to be an enormous act of self-harm. On the other side of that equation, you're going to see academics thinking, if this is the rules of engagement, for me being a professor at an elite institution in America, then why the hell do I want to stay in this country? Why don't I go somewhere else? And I guess if you're Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial, LSE, the Sorbonne, Sciences Po, wherever it happens to be, you're licking the lips at the prospect of getting some of the brightest brains in America coming over to Europe because they can't stand it in America any longer. Now, as I said at the start, there is a riddle about why this has happened. It's even gone from Baron Trump applying to Harvard and not getting in, and that is why Donald Trump is so fixated on punishing Harvard. There are others that maybe he'd been rejected himself from going there. Who knows? But the attack is in full force, and the question is, how long does Harvard stand firm? How long does Harvard continue to resist the onslaught that is coming from the White House? Well, let's speak now to Ryan Enos, political scientist at Harvard University, where he's the professor of government and director of the Center for American Political Studies. And Ryan, I talked about in the introduction there what Caroline Levitt said, saying, you know, we need more kind of plumbers and electricians. We don't need more LGBTQ graduates. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I saw this statement by her, and it was shocking in many respects, because let's think about what she did here. So I think without knowing it, she managed to insult electricians and plumbers, to act like that was some pawn in her political pandering rather than a profession that one would take on and contribute to society. She managed to insult LGBTQ people, to say there was something wrong with them in society, and she managed to insult Harvard grads, all in the same statement. And in many ways, I don't know what the point of it was, but I think that American society, the thing to be clear on, and world society more generally, has benefited tremendously from the people that come out of Harvard. And not only Harvard, but the higher education system in the United States more generally. It's been a model for the world in many things. It's something that Americans are justifiably proud of. And these attacks on it, somehow turning this into some kind of petty political game where they're trying to create class warfare between plumbers and Harvard grads, if that's what they're trying to do, does nothing for American society. It does nothing for the world. And frankly, I think they should be ashamed of making statements like that.
Why do you think they are? Because ask anyone around the world, name me a great American institution, and I suspect the first one that they will name is Harvard University.
Yeah. And, I think that unfortunately, Donald Trump doesn't have that kind of world vision, where he looks and says, how do we see things from a broader perspective like that? He cares about his own political grievances, and this is what he's pursuing right now, is his own political grievance. But I think more seriously, more darkly in many ways, and this is me speaking as a political scientist, what we see Donald Trump doing is attacking pillars of civil society in the way that authoritarians do. So authoritarians across the world, in places like Hungary, in places like Turkey, in places like Venezuela, when they wanted to dismantle democracy, they attacked, in addition to law firms and the press, which is what Donald Trump has also attacked, they attacked universities because they see universities as places of dissent. And Donald Trump has come up with a lot of pretexts for why he wants to attack Harvard. Things like saying it is, in league with the Chinese Communist Party, or is anti-Semitic, or things like that have no real basis in reality. And he's doing it because he wants to attack Harvard to take apart segments of American civil society to further his authoritarian agenda.
There was a lot of anti-Semitism on campuses in the US. Isn't he right to raise this as an issue and therefore to demand that there are certain things put in place so that the academic faculty is not encouraging this sort of behavior?
So I would challenge somebody to find academic faculty at Harvard or anywhere else that has encouraged anti-Semitic behavior. I would never say that there's not anti-Semitism at American universities, because there's anti-Semitism everywhere in the world. And of course, that's a problem that people should deal with and people should think about how to solve. But it would be wrong, and I will stand by the statement, and I would encourage anybody that disagrees with me to come and actually spend time at Harvard and talk to the people here. It would be wrong to say that Harvard has an acute problem of anti-Semitism, that is some kind of crisis that has to be dealt with, that the president of the United States has to come in a heavy-handed way and take control of a university to stop something that has rampant anti-Semitism. That simply does not coincide with reality. And I don't think a reasonable person that has actually spent time at Harvard would think that it represents this reality that Donald Trump has tried to sell to the world.
I started off by asking you about the Caroline Levitt quote, and I just wonder whether there is an anti-intellectualism that maybe has always been in America in certain places, that frankly you distrust academics, and also they're unlikely to garner much public support because they live in their ivory towers, they research irrelevant subjects. Who cares about them?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And, you put your finger on something that I think is a powerful current of American society. America has always sort of had an anti-intellectual and, anti-elite vein in it, right? This is, the great democratic experiment of the United States in some ways has always sort of compared itself to the British and thought, we don't have we don't have elitism, we don't have a monarchy. And so therefore, we don't like these things. And that runs through a lot of what we see in American politics. Nevertheless, we've built these elite institutions like Harvard, and we have, extreme wealth inequality and all these things we claim we don't like. And so I think that unfortunately, there's a powerful current of American politics that can be tapped into in this anti-intellectualism, and part of that is what Donald Trump is doing. But what's remarkable about that, and it's interesting because myself and one of my colleagues who wrote a lot about this over the past several months, we said that if Harvard takes a stand for democracy and takes a stand against Trump, that America will rally to its side. And in some ways, we weren't sure about that. We were kind of getting out over our skis a little bit, if you appreciate that expression. And we weren't sure if we were right. And I think in many ways, it turns out that we were, because remarkably, American society has really embraced Harvard. As a political scientist, I actually have polling data on this where we've looked and said, how favorably do people find Harvard? And the popularity of Harvard has gone way up, where people once, sort of didn't like it, maybe for understandable reasons, and have really rallied to its side. And I think what that shows is, putting aside all the anti-intellectualism or whatever runs through American society, what that shows is that Americans, when it comes down to it, do appreciate democracy. And we can talk about all the reasons we have Donald Trump, but when he attacks institutions of the United States and attacks civil society, Americans don't like that. And they see this for what it is. And even if it's an attack on Harvard, they ultimately don't believe that the government should be doing those things.
So what about the other thing that has kind of emerged overnight, which is that US embassies around the world, here in Europe, have been told stop processing visa applications for Harvard applicants, which I guess if you're 18 years old and you have won the golden ticket to a place at Harvard University or Yale or Princeton or any other school in America, you must be thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, if I were one of the elite universities in the UK, if I were at Oxford or Cambridge or LSE or any other place, I'd be celebrating that, because I would know that all of a sudden these students would be turning my attention to these other wonderful universities in the world. And the reason I mention that is I think that this is representing a tremendous self-harm to the United States. The United States has benefited so much. I mean, we forget as Americans what a privilege it is that people want to come and study in the United States. The best and the brightest from all over the world come here. And it's not something that has to be that way. It's not something that was given down by God or something. It's because we built these great institutions. And if we all of a sudden turn off that spigot, if we do this self-inflicted wound, they're going to go elsewhere. And I would think it would be wonderful. Let me tell you, if they all turn around and want to go to the UK, I think that'd be great. But what I'm worried about in the long term is that eventually they're going to go to China, because that is the place that's tried to rival the United States in its higher education system. And ultimately it can't, because a lot of people don't want to go to an unfree society. They don't want to go to a place where they have to worry about freedom of speech and they have to worry about the other things that you have to put up with in Chinese society. But now we see international students being picked up off the street in the United States for their speech. If I were an international student, I would think twice about coming to the United States. And I think the harm that we're doing with these current actions may be very hard and take a long time for us to undo.
Yeah. And presumably the corollary of what you've just said is that if an academic feels that they can't follow research or their social media posts might get scrutinized by the administration, they're going to think, screw this, why am I staying in America? I could go to Cambridge, Oxford, the Sorbonne, LSE, Imperial College, wherever, and do this and have a whole lot less hassle.
Yeah, of course. We've already seen a little bit of this. There's even one of the most striking examples of this were the prominent scholars of fascism that actually left and went to Canada. That's maybe should be a warning to all of us. But we see this in other cases as well. It's not only people having to worry about speech, but it's the pullback of scientific funding in the United States. Trump has turned off much of the federal funding towards science and towards medical research. And if you're a scientist, and you look and you say, well, where can I go and not have to worry about being harassed by the government, and where can I get adequate science funding? At this point, it's probably going to be somewhere in Europe. And if it's not, as I said, in the long term, I mean, China is trying really hard to court these scientists. And I think for democratic societies in the West, that's what we should really be worried about, is that Trump, by doing this kind of thing, is not only damaging American institutions, but he's sort of damaging what has been in many ways one of the great advantages of the democratic West, which is our leadership in education and science.
Ryan, do you think you're getting anywhere in making this argument? Do you think there are those in the administration who are kind of quietly sympathizing with you and saying, look, I've got your back here, but, I've just got to raise it in a very subtle way because you know what Donald Trump's like?
Ultimately, I don't know. I think it's not a good sign for American society when we spend a lot of our time trying to sort of psychoanalyze Donald Trump and decide what he wants, because that shows that we have one person that's too powerful in the United States right now. But I do hear, from people, and when you work at a place like Harvard, you kind of know well-connected people, and a lot of them say something similar to what you're saying, that a lot of people think this is kind of madness, and it is something that ultimately they hope sanity will prevail, because they understand that you don't make America great by attacking America's great institutions. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that American society is largely on Harvard's side, and because they see that it's not just about Harvard, they don't care about Harvard, and I understand that, but they see this as something, a larger principle around democracy. And so I think that a lot of them are on Harvard's side, and ultimately what will probably constrain the Trump administration is the American people. Public opinion matters even for people that want to be authoritarians. And I think that ultimately this, and we already see the data on this is something that's very unpopular for the Trump administration to do and will probably backfire.
We've been struck, I think, particularly this second term, by the extent to which there seems to be a streak of vengeance where Donald Trump is going after anyone and anything where he feels he's been slighted, whether it be law firms that wouldn't touch his work because they thought he was kind of reputationally damaging, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
Is there something personal about why the manner in which he's going, look, there are plenty of Ivy League schools, but it seems to be that Harvard in particular is in the crosshairs.
Yeah, people have speculated all kinds of things, like whether, he, wasn't admitted at some point or something like that. And I mean, who knows? I mean, we know that Donald Trump, remarkably, despite being the most powerful person in the world, is a remarkably petty person, and he seems to fixate on grievances that he has with individuals, no matter how important or unimportant they are. And I wouldn't doubt that some of it plays into that. I think that more largely, as I mentioned, it was natural and it was predictable, and many of us saw this coming, that Donald Trump would attack universities. And Harvard is the most famous university in the United States. And so when he singled out universities, eventually it was natural that he was going to come for Harvard. I think if Harvard would have capitulated, then he might have moved on. When Harvard said no, which was the right thing to do, then that meant that he doesn't like being told no, and he is going to keep fixating on it. And I think that's the world we're in now.
I would imagine that within Harvard and on the various boards, there are those who think, God, we've got to go for easy life. Can't we settle this? Can't we come to some kind of compromise in the way that Colombia did? Colombia sort of settled and said, OK, we'll find a new way of living with you. Doesn't that make Harvard's position more difficult?
Well, yes, and I'll tell you, when the thing to be clear about with Colombia, of course, is that that didn't end the matter. They came back with more demands, and in many ways, I think Colombia would still be under the spotlight if Harvard hadn't pushed back, and now they've changed their attention to Harvard. And there were those people at Harvard, and I know there are because I've talked to them, that thought, we should settle. And many of us said no, because, it's like when you're settling with a bully saying like, okay, I'll give you my money this one time and then expect you to walk away and never come back. And that's not the nature of authoritarianism. And ultimately, what Trump did, which I think made, in certain respect, the lack of settlement easier, was that he made these outrageous demands that made it really hard for Harvard to say yes, because it would have essentially been it would have taken away our independence as an institution. It would have ended the independence of the most prominent institution of higher education in the United States, and that would have been a shocking thing to see happen.
Is it weird that here you are, an academic who has made a cold, desiccated study of these things from afar, of authoritarianism, of elites, and you now find yourself in its petri dish?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we've reflected on a lot. By we, I guess I mean people like myself, political scientists in the United States, because I think in many ways, we always thought this was something we studied from afar, almost like an astronomer studying a distant galaxy or something. And we'd say, what happens, in other countries when this happens. And I think in a certain respect, and maybe I'm in this category, I don't know if other people are as well, I think this created sort of blinders for us in some ways, where we didn't expect to see this coming in the United States, and sometimes didn't recognize it because we didn't know what authoritarianism would look like here.
Ryan Enos, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I mentioned the riddle of Harvard a few moments ago. There is also the riddle of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And we'll be talking in a moment to a former senior CIA field officer about all of that.
I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all.
Mr. President, what do you want to do about that?
I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. We'll see what we're going to do. What am I going to tell you? You're the fake news, aren't you? You're totally fake. All right, any other?
I'm totally surprised. Well, he shouldn't really be that surprised, should he? Because, let's face it, Vladimir Putin has been doing that for over 3 years now, of firing rockets into Ukraine. But Donald Trump does seem suddenly affronted by the behaviour of Vladimir Putin and by the Russian armed forces in continuing to prosecute its campaign against Ukraine. Of course, being pissed off with Vladimir Putin is a very different thing from doing anything about it. Yet, in his posts on Truth Social and when he's at the foot of Air Force One, there does seem to be a very different tone. What Vladimir Putin doesn't realise, he's written on Truth Social, is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. And he said that Vladimir Putin was playing with fire after the Russian attack on Ukraine. And does this mean that Vladimir Putin is now likely to face sanctions from Donald Trump? Does it mean that President Trump is going to suddenly increase arms equipment going to Ukraine so that it can defend itself and attack Russia? I mean, these are the huge questions that we don't know the answer to. The shift in tone is substantial towards Vladimir Putin. Whether there is a matching shift in action is, of course, the bit we don't know yet. But let's speak now to Mark Polymeropoulos, who is the co-presenter of a new global podcast, The Crisis Room, which I'm very much looking forward to. But he was also one of the CIA's most highly decorated operations officers, serving in multiple field and headquarters assignments for the US government and specialising in counterterrorism, the Middle East and South Asia. I always think that with Trump, you kind of, do you judge the words or do you judge the actions? Because it seems for years Donald Trump has never wanted to say a bad word about Vladimir Putin, which has caused a lot of people to scratch their heads.
Well, I think you're right. And, so many news reports right now are talking about this rhetoric from Trump, tougher talk. He's upset. He's disappointed. He's angry. He's amazingly enough surprised that the Russians kind of conducted these days of brutal assaults with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, as well as, of course, drones and the decoys. This, of course, should surprise nobody. That's a separate issue. But I think you're right in the notion of Trump is talking tougher now, but in reality, he's done nothing. And for many of us in the national security world, particularly those who have been such proponents of assisting the Ukrainians, whether we did it when I was, for example, in government, or now as I'm outside of government, now's the time for action. We need sanctions to the max. We need to arm Ukraine to the teeth. Yet Trump has done, frankly, nothing. And one thing that I think is important to note in terms of U.S. politics is at some point, it's not only the Trump administration, but also the Republican Party as a whole, including the Republican hawks on Russia in the Senate, who are ending up complicit in the abandonment of Ukraine if we do nothing.
Do you think that may be changing now? That Vladimir Putin just ignoring Trump's pleas for a ceasefire, carrying on prosecuting the war in this brutal way, as you've just described, is emboldening those kind of hawkish Republicans to say, Mr. President, you must do something about this?
Well, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial from Senator Graham today, and Senator Graham is an important voice. This is Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, a Trump confidant, but also a big hawk when it comes to supporting the Ukrainians. He has put together a sanctions package that apparently is veto-proof in the U.S. Senate, meaning it could get by with Republican and Democratic support, and Trump would actually have to, even if he vetoed it, it would become law. And that would put 500% tariffs on countries such as India and China, frankly, that do business with Russia in fields of oil and gas. This is what we need to have happen. And so you do see the voices on the Republican side becoming, more emboldened. The big question is, does it resonate with Trump? And he still seems hesitant to actually go down the line of actually putting sanctions on. And that is even without the idea of arming the Ukrainians further, which, of course, I and many others have really promoted. But I'm not even sure that's on the table right now. So we're talking about a sanctions package. It's out there. Will the Republicans go forth without the okay of the White House? That's the big question in Washington now.
Do you believe that sanctions will lead to a change in behaviour of Vladimir Putin? I mean, when the invasion happened, I remember everyone touting that this was the biggest sanctions package ever. This is going to really hurt him. Well, since when the Russian economy, of course, has suffered, but it's moved on to a wartime footing and still carries on.
So you bring up a great point. It actually pains me that I'm here actually promoting sanctions because I actually believe you. I think that's certainly not enough. I think that the Russian economy has been able to weather what already were crippling sanctions. But the one thing that I believe, and I'll be very just frank on this now, that would change Vladimir Putin's behavior is sending more Russian troops home in body bags. And that means more weapons. And it's not just defensive weapons that the Ukrainians desperately need, these Patriot missiles that would help with the ballistic missile attacks from Russia, but it's also offensive weaponry. It's the idea of either the U.S. transferring this like they did under the Biden administration, or even the U.S. selling the Ukrainians under foreign military sales. Maybe that's something that we could do. And then most importantly, I think, or most likely, is the U.S. allowing our European allies or overseas partners to transfer U.S. origin kit to the Ukrainians. The U.S. does need to approve that, but that is actually what has to happen in order to have real change. So we're talking about sanctions and weapons. Sanctions are our first part. I guess we're at the point where the bar is so low that if Trump did go forward with this sanctions package that Lindsey Graham has put forward, we would be a bit encouraged. But I think you're right. There's more to it than just sanctions. We have to continue arming the Ukrainians.
And Mark, Donald Trump posted the other day, what Vladimir Putin doesn't realise is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have happened already to Russia. And I mean really bad. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
So first of all, I found that incredibly ironic because it's almost it's a tacit admission that Trump has been helping Putin. So he's saying that, in essence, I've been covering for you for so long to try to get to the negotiating table, and now you're not listening. So, what more could Trump be talking about? I don't know. These running foreign policy via true social posts. I think I have PTSD from the first Trump administration about this, and now we're back to it again. So deciphering what exactly he means, I would imagine it's additional U.S. weaponry, offensive weaponry, but. I think this is Trump in essence lashing out, but not realizing that he's actually admitting that he has been covering for Putin for some time, and that's the way we all took it. We all kind of smiled and noted that, wow, that was kind of a very clear understanding where the Trump administration, where Trump in particular has been for the first 100+ days.
I was at that jaw-dropping news conference in Helsinki between Trump and Putin, and that occasion where Trump was asked about whether he took Putin at his words that there had been no Russian interference in the 2016 election, and he said, I've got no reason to disbelieve Vladimir Putin's assurances, even though every intelligence agency in the United States of America said there had been election interference. Do you understand the relationship between Trump and Putin? Can you explain it? I mean, I know that the CIA thinks long and hard and tries to understand these things and does huge amounts of analysis on it. And I just wonder what your kind of, hot take is on it.
Well, first of all, you bring up an event which I think will go down, in the annals of U.S. diplomatic history as one of the most disheartening and depressing that certainly I ever encountered. I was in government at the time, and it was devastating for members of the intelligence community because the evidence was so overwhelming. It was known kind of on a bipartisan basis how the Russians had interfered, and so that was a tremendous slap at the intelligence community. And I think that was just the beginning of a very contentious relationship. The relations, though, between Trump and Putin have been kind of, studied and discussed and talked about. And where I come down on this, and people can believe me or they cannot, is someone in terms of Donald Trump who just admires an autocratic leader. He admires someone who has a strong hold on a country that Trump wishes he had over the United States, which, of course, is a democracy. He's had an affinity for Russia since the 80s when, of course, he visited with the whole Miss America pageant. But it's just, I think it's a style of government that he wishes he could replicate in the U.S. And, of course, that is not the case. There's been so much written about, is there any kind of actual, relationship, perhaps business ties, perhaps even something more nefarious. And, I would say that, history will judge that. At some point, the U.S. or perhaps our allies in the U.K. will get a hold of the actual Russian intelligence files on their assessment of Trump. There was a famous case decades ago where a KGB officer named Mitrokhin came out and actually gave the British government, gave MI6 in essence, cases full of their archives. That's what we'll need at some point to see exactly what the Russians are thinking about Trump. But at this point, I see someone who just shares an affinity for autocracy, and unfortunately is taking the U.S. down a path where the tilt towards Moscow is something that is real, that is extremely depressing to a lot of us who worked in national security, and it remains to be seen once again in Ukraine if Trump is going to change course and actually confront Putin.
And he raised another issue of kind of, which if you're in the intelligence community, as you were and served your country for so many years, what you don't want to see is your politicians being compromised by foreign leaders. What did you make of Donald Trump accepting the small gift from Qatar of an Air Force One?
I mean, the best word I could describe this is preposterous. I worked in the United States government, and I have lots of great gifts that I don't have right now because I had to give them back because they literally were worth more than about $220 US. I remember when I was in the Middle East one time, a Middle Eastern head of state gave me a beautiful watch engraved with the royal seal of that country. And I took it and I thanked him and I wore it for several days and I gave it back to the US government because I was not allowed to accept it. Accepting a $400 million airplane is preposterous. I think it's embarrassing to the United States. I can't imagine that the United States Secret Service or the National Security Team thinks this is a good idea because of the potential, not only the ethics part of it, but of the security compromises. They're going to have to tear this airplane apart piece by piece. I think I saw estimates it might cost $1 billion to refurbish properly. But it looks terrible as a former U.S. Official, and it's going to go down again one of these pieces of history, which are not really proud moments for the United States. And let me also say one additional thing is for those who work in the U.S. government who have to abide by ethic laws, like I did, having to give back anything over about $200. It just throws the whole system into chaos.
Mark, the thing that strikes me of comparing the first Trump term when I was in Washington to now when I'm back in London is that Trump does seem to have acquiescence, almost total control of all the agencies that he presides over. What are your fellow CIA officers who are still there thinking? Are they thinking it's a new regime, new sheriff in town, we've just buckle up and get on with it? Or do you think there is any kind of pushback to some of the things that are happening?
Well, when you take the oath at CIA, I remember the day, January 3rd, 1993, you take an oath to the Constitution, not to the president. And that's very clear. And so I think that what CIA officers do is they get up every day and they kind of put their nose to the ground and they do their job and they do it to the best of their abilities. And when what you have to have is a moral compass in which if you're asked to do something that is not legal. And there's a lot of things the CIA does that people may find unsavory, but it's legal, so we operate actually under very strict regulations. But if something, if any administration asks a CIA officer to do something that is illegal, they have to have that kind of moral courage to say no and to speak out. And I think that's probably where most of my, former colleagues who are still in are sitting on this. Because at the end of the day, the CIA is the nation's first line of defense. We're standing on the ramparts. The intelligence community has an incredibly difficult job now with a very chaotic world. I would lie to you. I'd be lying if I said people are not concerned with this very kind of unusual president. But I think that at the end of the day, they're just trying to do their job. One of the great things about when you work in the intelligence community is, of course, is that you're in secure spaces, so you can't get on social media. You actually can't read any kind of tweets or true social posts. So ultimately, there's a bit of a less of a distraction. And if you're, of course, overseas in the foreign field, you're doing a far different job. Spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, and handling agents, spies. So you're a little busy to be paying attention to this, but I would be lying to say that people are not uncomfortable with the current situation. I think they just want to do their job and do it to the best of their abilities.
Mark Polymeropoulos, thank you so much for joining us, and the very best of luck with your new podcast, The Crisis Room, available, of course, on Global Player. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One of the more arcane bits of US politics is getting spending bills through both houses so that they can go to the president's desk for approval. And Donald Trump has been going on and on and on about getting a big and beautiful spending deal passed through Congress that would pave the way for tax cuts, that would support some of his favourite projects, but would add massively to the US deficit. And a lot of people who were part of the Tea Party movement, have signed up to this because they want an easy life from Donald Trump, are sanctioning a massive expansion of US government debt with uncertain consequences of what it means for the US economy. Whether it gets through the Senate as easily is another matter. But one person is deeply, deeply unhappy about it. And that is the person who was brought in to bring government spending under control. None other than Mr. Elon Musk, head of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. And whilst he was there with his chainsaw, Donald Trump has been out with his checkbook, and Musk is not impressed.
So, I was disappointed to see the massive spending bill, frankly, which increases the budget deficit, not just decrease it, and undermines the work that the DOGE team is doing.
I actually thought that when this big, beautiful bill came along. I mean, everything he's done on Doge gets wiped out in the first year.
I think a bill can be big or it can be beautiful, but I don't know if it could be both.
my personal opinion.
That was Elon Musk speaking on CBS. And wow, there is a quantum difference there between Donald Trump's position and Elon Musk's. And, you know, people have speculated that this relationship would have to implode at some point. I don't know whether this is the moment, but Donald Trump will hate over criticism like that, because that will fuel the unease in the markets right now. And let's face it, the markets have been jittery up enough over the whole tariffs policy. Well, there is now a whole new front which could lead, could, not will, but could lead to some kind of sovereign debt crisis in America, with people thinking that the size of the deficit is just unsustainable and you can't keep adding to it in the way that Donald Trump is. And Musk, who came in to bring some financial orthodoxy to the government affairs, metaphorically tearing his hair out at what Donald Trump is doing. We will watch this relationship closely. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents USA.